All right, welcome everybody. We are here today with SCORE and the SBA for our Marketing Virtual Academy. And SCORE is located in all across the country, and you can get a mentor and it's all free. If you're struggling with any business, anything, and you want just somebody to bounce ideas off of, somebody to kind of ask if you're on the right path, from the beginnings of an idea to already being in business for a long time, SCORE mentors are there, and they all have an area of expertise to help you with, and they can help you. So you just go to SCORE Omaha and they are all there. You can pick whoever you want. So the SBA is also a co-sponsor of these workshops, and Elizabeth Yearwood is with us, and she's going to share a little bit about the SBA. Maybe.
Yes, I am. Elizabeth Yearwood just took a giant bite of her lunch. Apologies for that. It never fails. So here at the seriously, I really do need to take smaller bites. This happens to me every time. Anyhow, the SBA is a federal agency, and we are actually the go-to resource on the federal side for folks who are looking to start, grow, expand, and recover their small businesses. We have lots of guaranteed loan programs that are available to help entrepreneurs get access to capital. We can help folks get started in the federal contracting realm, and then we also have disaster loan programs. So if anybody has questions about any of that, please feel free to reach out to me.
All right, excellent. We are getting started now with Zach Nelson, and he's going to be talking about public relations. If at any point during the session you have any questions, go ahead and click on the chat button, which is probably at the bottom of your screen. If you run your mouse over it, and next to the green button it says chat, click on that and you can ask a question, and he will be responding to those throughout the session. And hopefully we'll have some extra time at the end for him to even do more questions and answers. So, Zach, you're on.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Kelly. And thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your lunch hour to come talk with us today about public relations. I am going to turn off my video just for the sake of bandwidth, if I can remember how to do that. Can everybody see the screen with the PowerPoint on it? Thumbs up? Yes? Okay, cool. So far, we are off to a good start with technology, so that is always a plus. So today we're going to talk about public relations as a marketing tool. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Zach Nelson. It's not uncommon, I think, when we talk about public relations to be seen as a tool that only big companies can afford to use, and it focuses primarily on traditional media. If that's your perception coming into today's presentation, then my goal is to help you recalibrate that and look at PR as a useful tool for your small business. So for the past decade, as some of you may have heard me talk about before we were getting started, I've worked with entrepreneurs, small businesses, nonprofits, and in government to help those folks develop a PR plan that accomplishes their core business or organizational objectives. If you've attended or watched one of my past presentations from this series, you know that I firmly believe that everything we do should be every marketing activity should be grounded in advancing a core business objective. So before we jump into the PR part of the presentation, let's recap on what core business objectives are, because I think that'll set the stage for the rest of this presentation. So typically when we talk about marketing activities advancing core business objectives, those core business objectives are really broad, and they tend to fall into four categories, right? Obviously, the first one is building brand awareness, making sure people know that your company exists, making sure they know what products and services you offer. Creating brand advocates is another major core business objective, right? That word of mouth marketing where you delight your customers so they go out and they talk about how wonderful your business is and bring more folks to you. Third is enhancing public relations. That's obviously what we're here to talk about today, and how that drives building brand awareness, creating brand advocates, and then ultimately driving sales and leads to your business. So if you're going to take away one buzzword from today's presentation, integrated marketing communications would be the buzzword to keep in mind. Typically, public relations has been viewed in its own silo, apart from marketing. There have been different teams, different reporting structures, and the advice on the internet about how to do public relations and how to do marketing has largely been kept separate. However, in recent years, things have started to change. Today, PR is viewed as part of marketing, although if you go over to the Public Relations Society of America's website, they'll tell you that marketing is actually part of PR. Regardless of how you view it, there are a number of different definitions over the years of what PR is. However, in 1982, the Public Relations Society of America asked their members, what is public relations? And the definition that they came up with, and is still widely used today, is public relations is a strategic communication process that builds mutually beneficial relationships between organizations and their publics. The PSRA is quick to point out that this definition, the new definition of public relations, not necessarily the one maybe you're familiar with if you watched Mad Men, focuses on relationship building and engagement. I also think it's important to focus on the word process and strategic communications in that definition too. So if we think about PR at a foundational level, it is a communication strategy that's designed to build a beneficial relationship between your organization and the public, right? So whether those are referral sources, power partners, or even inside your own employees, or if you're in a bigger company, other divisions within your companies, public relations is all about building those relationships. It's also about telling a story that puts your business, your products or services, and your reputation in a positive light. When it's about earning people's attention, it's not about interrupting it. So if we think about contrasting this with marketing or specifically advertising, we're competing for the attention of our target audience. With PR though, our strategic communication channels is to find a way that we can deliver our message in a way that's non-interrupted. So typically that happens because your message is delivered by a third party, typically a trustworthy third party. Often people think of this as a reporter, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. It can be a neighborhood organization, a community leader, or a social influencer. So let's look at that idea of the third party being the one who's delivering your message. There are a lot of ways to communicate your marketing message out there. You have a website, you have a Facebook page, and perhaps you have other social media channels too. You can pay to place advertisements across the internet, radio, TV, bus benches, or in print. All of these placements are guaranteed. One of the things that sets PR apart from this is that placement is not guaranteed. You have to go to that third party who acts as a gatekeeper for whether or not your message will be distributed to their audience. Now, the benefit of this is because there's that trusted third party who's mediating your message to their audience, audiences tend to be less skeptical when an unpaid third party is sharing the message. I'll give you an example of this that I'm working on with a client right now. So I've got a property development company that recently completed the build of high-end luxury apartments. And honestly, the timing could not have been worse. Not only are we trying to lease high-end luxury apartments in an economic downturn, we've also got interest rates at a historic low, making homeownership an attractive option. So in the high-end rental market, our main competition is actually mortgage companies and homeownership, not other apartment complexes. Now, obviously, consumers are going to be skeptical anytime an apartment company talks about the best financial solution is renting over homeownership. So our public relations activities right now are reaching out to personal finance people in the metro area to talk with them about when does it make sense to rent versus when does it make sense to own. So we were talking with financial planners and personal finance gurus who have blogs, podcasts, and decent social media following in the metro area that this client is working in. They're not here in Omaha. It's a slightly bigger metro, so we've got a bigger pool to choose from. Now, another key difference, though, between our PR efforts here and typical advertising is that the majority of our PR efforts are working with these financial gurus and personal financial planners to educate them on when it makes sense to rent versus when it makes sense to own. My client, the mention of their brands, their new apartment community is really secondary. What we're hoping to get out of this interaction with these third parties is a mention at the end. But the primary point is to get them to talk about renting versus owning so we can capture some of that marketing share. So like I said, we just started this undertaking about a month and a half ago, so it's too early to really talk about how that's going. But so far, we've seen interest. And I think that's another really key thing to remember is when you're starting a public relations plan out, it's going to take a while, right? Advertising is instant. You get to see return on your investment almost immediately. Marketing and content marketing has, a month to 3 months, depending on which channels you're using. PR can take several months to build. And then by the time you've actually built those relationships with those third parties, it can be 3 to 6 months down the road. So don't jump into this with expectations that your PR is going to result in immediate results. Sometimes it does, and that's wonderful. But have your expectations calibrated that it's going to take a while for these relationships to form and for your message to start reaching the audience of the third party you're working with. So before I jump into PR outreach activities, do we have any questions? I don't think I've seen anything pop up in the chat.
Nope, nothing there.
Okay, wonderful. So again, if you have questions as I'm going along, feel free to enter them in the chat. Kelly is being fantastic and watching the chat for me. So yeah, please use the chat box if you've got questions or comments. Okay, so let's talk about where to target your PR outreach efforts as a small business owner. Like I said in the beginning, traditional media is usually the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about PR, TV stations, radio stations, and newspapers. For those of you who are in the B2B or business to business space, trade publications can be a great source of PR. And don't think about trade publications that are necessarily just specific to your industry. If you are reaching out to, or if you have clients who are in other industries, also reach out to those trade publications. So my last corporate job was a company that provided patient advocacy services. We typically engaged trade publications for elder law attorneys, estate planners, social workers, and medical professionals. Again, these were all professionals that benefited, or these were all professionals whose clients benefited from patient advocacy services. So in addition to reaching out to the life care management space, which was our industry, we also reached out to the trade publications of those other industries. So think about kind of that ripple effect out from where you are when you're thinking about what trade publications would be beneficial for you to reach out to. Association newsletters are some of my favorite because these are typically easy to get into. And if you're already running a content marketing program, you're producing high quality content. So think about homeowner or neighborhood associations, business associations, or local chapters of professional associations. In some instances, even faith-based and religious associations make sense for some businesses. On that note, civic organizations are always a great place to target your PR efforts, especially if you don't mind public speaking. A lot of times these civic organizations are looking for an outside presenter for their meetings. So if you've got some content that you've created as part of your content marketing program, turning that into a slide deck or a presentation that you can go give to one of these organizations is a really great way to get in front of people and boost your credibility as an expert. And then finally, we've got online influencers. Now, I know when I say online influencers, that probably conjures up images of entitled millennials spending time in faraway resorts snapping selfies of themselves. Now, that's not what I'm talking about for the focus of this presentation. In this context, we're talking about people who have a large online following, whether that's a podcast, a blog, or a social media following. So if you think back to my last example, what I'm doing with my property management company, right? We're looking for local influencers who are writing blogs, doing podcasts, or have decent social media reach on that personal finance space. Later in the presentation, when we actually get into putting this all into practice, I'll show you how to hunt down these local online influencers to make it easier for you to find and start to engage with them. Always start locally, then move regionally and go national if it makes sense when going for any of these outlets. So if you're going for a trade publication, start with a local trade publication. And then if you get traction in there, work up to a regional and then a national. Another PR tactic that works really well for all of these is PR that builds on itself. So again, looking back to that last example I gave for my property management company, we do have a personal financial expert who I think is going to run with our rent versus own message to their audience. If that message gets well received by their audience and sees a fair amount of engagement, our next step is to go to a TV producer and pitch this as something that would air on one of their noontime segments. Now, to do this, I've done my research, right? I know that this TV station tends to do personal finance segments over their noon hour program. I've also figured out which producer tends to get those things scheduled. So we'll have really targeted outreach. But one of the keys, in my opinion, to getting in there, and this is based on previous experience, is being able to go to that producer and saying, hey, look, this smaller audience really liked this message and this information. We think this would do really well with your much bigger audience on the TV. I've had reporters and producers tell me, and I've been to conferences where they've talked about reporters who see engagement on social media are more likely to cover it. A colleague of mine had gone and pitched a reporter on a certain story 3 times, got absolutely nowhere with it. So they went ahead and just did their general media or marketing messaging through social media. They got a lot of attention on Facebook and Twitter with one of their posts. And a few days later, the reporter that they'd been unsuccessful pitching called them wanting to do a story because they saw that engagement. So if you're having a hard time, and it doesn't necessarily just have to be with a reporter, it could be with one of those associations or one of those civic organizations. I've done this with civic organizations where I posted some content to my YouTube channel. There's a tutorial and said, hey, look, this did really well on YouTube. I'd really like to come give this to your organization. And then I went, spoke at that organization and turned around and then promoted my speaking across my social media channels as a way to show that I'm trusted, right? So these are all strategies that you can use to build your brand and have PR that really leverages itself and continues to grow. Any questions before we jump into how to position your PR?
Nope, there's no questions.
Fantastic. Okay, so before you approach someone to set up your, to be the recipient of your PR message, you need to do some planning ahead of time. So the first question you want to ask is put yourself in their shoes and say, what's in it for me? So if I go to this personal financial expert who I've been talking about, right, I've got to answer the question, what's in it for them, right? Why would they want to carry this PR message? If you go to a neighborhood association or a civic organization to speak, right, answer, what's in it for them? Why would they want to let me have access to their audience? The next question that you need to answer is, what's in it for their audience, right? If they grant you access to their audience, why would their audience be interested in your PR message? So once you've got those 2 questions worked out in your head, the next thing that you need to answer for your positioning is, what's the story here? So you're going to be pitching a story, whether it's to the news media, to an association, or any of those organizations you talk about. What is it? Make sure you've got a concise answer to that in your head. And we're going to go over how to put this into practice here in just a minute. So here's the theory part. I know it's kind of abstract, but hang with me for a minute and we'll actually look at this in practice. The next question that you want to ask is, why should anyone care about this, right? So one of the things I see, especially when I worked in a franchise system and we had franchisees coming wanting to pitch information to the media, was, why would anyone care? Right. A lot of times for those of us in the industry, we think our message is super important and everybody should care about it because we're passionate about what we do. But take a step back and think about that audience that's going to be receiving the message. Why should they care? Next, ask yourself, why should they care now? Right? There's a difference because a lot of times you're going to find it easier for your PR message to be picked up if there's a timely reason to care about this right now. And we'll talk a little bit about how to position it so people think about caring about it now. Before we get there though, a few additional considerations to talk about that will help improve your chances of your PR message being received and then redistributed to the audience. First, ask yourself, is this new? Is it unusual? Is there human interest component to it? And finally, is there a compelling visual? And compelling visuals, this has gotten a lot easier to talk about because news, radio, everybody's got social media now. Everybody wants to get that click from their Facebook page back to their page. So having that compelling visual makes it really easy for the outlet that's posting this for you on their Facebook page to drive traffic back to their website. So when you're thinking about especially if it's going to be an in-person event, how can you create a compelling visual to go along with that? So when we think about those are the ways we position it. Now, there are two ways that we can use that positioning to get PR coverage. The first one is to create a story, and the second one is to follow a story. So let's talk about how to create a story first. Original research tends to be one of the ways, especially for those of us in the B2B space, that we tend to get coverage. Along with that is noticing a trend. These two tend to be the foundation of content marketing. So if you do any cornerstone content marketing, right, where you're doing some original research or you're talking about trends that are happening in the industry, a lot of times as content marketers, we'll turn that into a white paper, a downloadable presentation, a webinar, something like that. But we can take that content marketing and then re-leverage it out as creating a story with that positioning I just talked about to get out there. And again, I promise once we get through the theory, we'll actually take some concrete examples and look at it here. Events are a good way to create a story. Sponsorships are another good way. And then again, you're going to hear me talk about human interest over and over and over, because honestly, in my experience for the last, probably decade and a half now doing public relations, human interest has always been the one that has consistently got the most attention. I'm going to give you an example of that here later in the presentation. Okay, so we can create a story and push that out there as our public relationship or as our public relations. We can also follow a story. So this happens when there is significant news that impacts your business or your industry. When new research, data, or trends are discussed in the national media or released by a trade organization that relates again to your industry or surrounds events. So let me give you an example of a story that combines both of these. So this is Chad Gross. He's actually a member of my business networking group, and he was in the Omaha World Herald right around the time I was putting this together. So he's got as COVID hit, he's got an IT company. As COVID hit, he gave his employees a $250 bonus and then asked them to go spend that money locally to support other small businesses, right? So that's significant news. He's following a story. The pandemic is really still all we're talking about in 2020. And it was human interest because he was doing something nice for his employees and also trying to raise up other small businesses in the community. Now, I haven't had a chance to talk to Chad since this hit the Omaha World Herald, so I don't know how he got this story into the World Herald or how I wasn't involved in it, how he got this planted. But it was a really great example of a local small business owner getting PR for a human interest story that followed significant news. Completely lost my train of thought there. So we'll take a pause for questions if we've got any. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and take all this theory now and we're going to turn it into actual strategies you can use in your business. So any questions on the larger overall theory of what is PR? How does it work?
There's nothing there.
Okay, I guess I'm just answering all these questions. But that's what I'm going to let myself believe here. Okay, so let's talk about tools of the trade. Obviously, press releases, again, when we think public relations, press releases tend to be the first thing that come to mind. Giving speeches, special events, market research, content creation, social media, influencer outreach, and then crisis communications. So let's go ahead and talk through all of these and how you can use them. So I'm going to start with press releases because I think when you start the public relations process, even if you're not going to issue a press release, if you're doing influencer outreach, for example, I wouldn't send a press release to an influencer. If you're doing outreach to a neighborhood association, I wouldn't necessarily send a press release to the neighborhood association. But the press release, structuring your PR in the form of a press release brings order to it. So even if you don't sit down and write up a formal press release for all of your PR activities, I really recommend thinking through it in the way you would structure a press release, no matter what type of PR you're going after, what that outreach is going to look like. So let's take a look at how to create a press release. I thought these were going to introduce one by one. Apparently, they decided not to. Okay, so at the top of your press release, there is going to be a contact block. This is going to always start off your press release. And I think it's really important to point out that there is a format here that is expected and you should use it. Now, the reason for this is a lot of news organizations are now using optical character recognition software, OCR, that they'll scan press releases into, and then that will populate a database for them. So if you don't use the standard format for a press release, that's going to confuse the computer, and it may mean that the software doesn't populate the database properly. And what I found is when that happens, humans tend not to go fix it. Your press release just gets discarded. So this is the format you want to follow for that reason primarily. So always at the top, start off with a contact block. This is who the press should contact if they want more information about what's contained in the press release. Logo is not necessary. I tend to include it, especially for my nonprofit or business clients, just to further advance that branding. You'll have a release date. This typically says for immediate release or embargoed until. You would embargo a press release if you're making an announcement. Maybe you're doing an opening or a new product launch and you're going to have people come to your business, or you're going to do a virtual event on Zoom, and you don't necessarily want this getting out in the media until that happens. I typically don't embargo press releases. I just schedule that email to send later. You can do that now through Outlook and G Suite. So that's typically how I handle that release date. The next piece is the headline. And this headline is really crucial. If you do email marketing, this is similar, right? Just like in email marketing, your subject line is the most important thing that guarantees whether or not that email get open. Your headline is the most important thing in deciding whether or not the reporter is going to look down the rest of your press release. So when you're writing a headline, we're going to look at an example here in just a minute. You want to use strong action verbs. You want to be direct. You want to be concise. And you want to be comprehensive. And that's challenging, being concise and being comprehensive. So we'll look at an example here in just a second. After your headline is going to come your lead-in sentence. In this sentence, you want to use vivid language, action verbs, and present tense is really important. And then we get into the heart of the press release, right? We're going to have our intro paragraph. Typically, you'll have 2 to 3 quotes in your press release. And this is really important because if your press release gets picked up by a TV or a radio station, oftentimes the anchor or the show's host will only read the quotes out of the press release. So these quotes should be concise and highlight the key points of information that you want your audience to know. And then finally, at the very end of the press release, typically in italics, is boilerplate. And this is just background information about your organization. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example. So off to the side here, we can see I've got all of the different parts of a press release. I know that's incredibly small. So let's look at it one by one here. So we've got the contact block and the logo, just like I talked about, right? Then we've got our headline. And you can see our headline here is using action words. So regional nonprofit working to help flood impacted Nemaha County recover, right? So those are action words. We are being concise, but we're also being comprehensive because we're talking about the flood and we're talking about a decently sized area. Next is that really important lead sentence, right? This is going to frame up the entire press release. So we are saying on the long road to recovery, the Northeast Nemaha Long-Term Recovery Group is working to help the area emerge from the 2019 floods stronger than before. So one of the things that I'm doing in this lead-in sentence is I'm using a storytelling tactic, right? I'm framing this up as a journey, and I'm framing it up in terms of a struggle, right? The struggle is the flood set us back, and we're trying to rebuild stronger than before. So the next part of the press release then is we've got the year, the month, the day. This is coming out of the long-term recovery group, is based in Peru. So we've got that. I've got my first sentence that sets the stage. After that, I've ghostwritten a quote. I tend to ghostwrite quotes for my clients. Obviously, if you're a small business owner, you're going to be writing your own quotes. I would say this: if you do engage outside help and they ghostwrite quotes for you, make sure you see that quote before it goes out to the media. There was an organization I worked at, our press shop drafted a press release and sent it out and did not tell me that they had ghostwritten quotes for me. I knew the reporter that received it, and that reporter just called me directly as opposed to going to our press office, and then starts asking me follow-up questions on that press release that I had not seen. I didn't even know what I had said. So if you engage outside help, and I've actually found this when I go to marketing conferences and talk with other folks about PR, is that some PR organizations are really bad about ghostwriting quotes and not showing them to clients first. So make sure you do that. Obviously, the way I'm doing this is I always write the quote and then highlight it so my clients know to fill in their names. So then finally, the last piece of the press release is going to wrap it up. The final paragraph here, we ended with a quote. I believe the mayor was the one who gave the final quote here. And then we've got that boilerplate. Again, that boilerplate, so that long, that italics down at the end of the screen, is really important. A lot of times TV and radio stations will use that boilerplate to introduce who the organization is and give their listeners context for what's going on. And then you can see the 3 pound signs or hashtags at the bottom. That just shows that the press release is done. This whole press release was 1 page long. I really recommend that you work to keep your press release to 1 page. So this press release went out about a month and a half, 2 months ago, I think. The release was picked up almost verbatim by 5 different media outlets. It found its way onto the UNL distribution list that went out to a statewide network of folks. 2 area radio stations picked it up, and then in my monitoring, for some reason, a newspaper in Kansas also picked up on this. But when you have a really well-written press release, a lot of times reporters will pick it up and run with it without doing much to it, especially in your smaller newspapers, where they may not have a lot of reporters trying to cover everything. If you write a really if you write a really good press release, you'll tend to see it reprinted. I know when I was in college, I did that frequently with the political science group that I was part of in my communications honor society. So if you're going to be doing press releases, I recommend SCORE has a lot of great resources on their website. Spend some time looking through SCORE's resources on how to write a press release. Are there any questions before we jump into some of the other methods for PR here?
Just a quick question about if they would receive the slides, and I said yes, I'll be emailing them all out after the presentation, and that the video will be on the SCORE Omaha YouTube channel.
Perfect. Okay, let's jump into influencer and association outreach. I'm going to group these two together because often it's the same. So as I mentioned, we're not talking about millennials taking selfies at resorts or with food here for influencers, right? When we think about who our influencers are, we're thinking about who has an audience of potential customers that I would like to reach or that I would like to do business with. And how can I structure my messaging to that influencer so that they will share the message with their audience? So again, we want to go back to, what's in it for them. Oftentimes the answer to that is content, especially if you're working with an association that's doing a newsletter or does some type of a publication and you've got good writing skills, you can provide content for that. So that's what's in it for them is content, right? It fills space. It gives them a reason to engage with their audience. What's in it for the audience tends to be information, right? Helpful information. If you're familiar with the idea of helpful marketing, right? That's going to dovetail really nicely in here, that you want to create marketing content that helps your audience. Here it's going to be really the same idea. It's just that the person who's delivering that helpful marketing content is going to be this trusted third party and not necessarily you doing it directly through your marketing channels, right? And because we're going through that trusted third party, remember, we get some credibility and the audience is going to be less skeptical of us. So it's actually really easy if you're already engaged in helpful marketing as part of your blogging or podcast strategy, or even in your email newsletter, that you can really easily turn that into PR messaging. Again, kind of structure like we went through that press release, and then go out to these influencers to see if they can pick that up for you. So again, when we're thinking about influencers, we're thinking about folks who have blogs, folks who have email lists, folks who have podcasts, or YouTubers who are all local. When it comes to organizations and associations, neighborhood associations, business associations, those types are really good. So as I alluded to, when we think about influencer and association outreach, this is really where the line between PR and content marketing starts to blur. I'm going to give you an example. I've got a client who does doors, windows, sidings, and roofs. About this time each year, he sits down and he writes about 24 articles that he will send out to neighborhood associations over the course of the coming year. When he puts this content together, again, he's answering those two questions. What's in it for me, the association that's going to be distributing the content, and what's in it for the audience? So the answer to that, what's in it for me, for these homeowners associations, is they're putting out monthly newsletters. Most of them are, at least the ones he's targeting, are putting out monthly or quarterly newsletters. So for them, they're getting high quality content that they can use in their newsletter, not have to generate it themselves. For the audience, he's giving them useful how-to tips. Now, again, we want to think back to how do you create that story? What he does here is he follows a story. He looks at events. So we know that spring is going to come around, and what's going to be on the minds of a lot of people is, right, getting your home ready for spring. In the winter, right, it's doing energy audits, making sure that the doors and the windows aren't leaking, giving homeowners advice on, how to winterize their house and get ready. So he's thinking about, as the calendar plays out, what are some topics that he can write about and then send those on to the homeowners associations to go out there. For this client, this is a really good relationship building exercise. He's creating high quality content that gives homeowners helpful advice that they can actually put into practice. Now, they're eventually going to need doors, windows, siding, and maybe a new roof. So because he's routinely been in that newsletter, they feel like they know him, they feel like they trust him, and he's much more likely to get a call. Now that he's been doing this for a few years, we're going to look and see if we actually see more business coming in those neighborhoods where he does a regular column for their HOA newsletter versus neighborhood where he's not in. We're just going to start that undertaking next January to look through that and see, if we can quantify that. But one of the things that I want to point out here is that it is hard to quantify the results of your PR campaign. So don't get too hung up on measuring dime for dime the return on investment here. Obviously, you do want to measure it. But again, measuring relationship building, even in this example, is kind of hard to do. So if you're wondering how to find these local influencers, I do have a pro tip. It is Google's advanced search. So if you're not familiar, there are a bunch of operators, brackets, curly braces, all capitalized words that you can type into Google to get it to narrow down your search. If you don't want to go through and learn all of those different operators, if you go to this website at the bottom, and as Kelly said, slides will be coming out after this, the google.com/advanced_search, it will bring up this handy page where you can go through and you can fill this out and then choose the region and really dial in on who is creating content in your space. So who's likely to have an audience that you would like to interact with or get your message in front of, and then find those folks who are here locally. Google Advanced Search is always where I start out when I am trying to identify those local influencers and those local associations. Oftentimes, I know here, this is the case in Omaha, city government maintains a list of all the homeowner associations that are active. I know Omaha just updated theirs 3 years ago to like find all the inactive associations and throw them out, and then get updated contact information. So the Omaha list is relatively new. In some communities in Missouri, I found that it's actually the police departments that hang on to that HOA information. So government databases can be your friend when you're trying to do this local influencer outreach. So speaking engagements is a great way to get in front of audiences if you are not terrified of public speaking. I enjoy public speaking. Obviously, I'm doing this, so this is a pretty natural one for me. And I've got a number of clients who have been really successful getting out and speaking to organizations to help boost their credibility. Now, public speaking doesn't necessarily mean that you're standing up in front of a stadium full of people. Oftentimes when I'm working with clients, the speaking engagements we go after are for those civic organizations that are a smaller group where they're only presenting for 10 to 15 minutes. I've got a doctor who has geriatric care management practice in a different state. He's a good speaker. And he gets a number of invites to come out and speak on senior care related issues as well as aging. So when he gets an invite to come speak, or he reaches out to an organization proactively and says, hey, I've got this speech I'd like to give, would you be interested in letting me come speak to your members? What we'll do is we'll highlight that engagement on social media. So if it's open to the public, or virtual and open to everybody, we'll put it on his blog and on his Facebook page and try to drive people to that event. If it's closed and it's only for members, what we'll do is after he's done speaking, we'll try to get a picture. You know, these days it's the picture of him with everybody on Zoom. Previously, what we did is we always had somebody in the room snap a picture of him up speaking. We'd then post that on social media, talk a little bit about the group that he spoke to and what he talked about. What that does is, one, it gets him in front of that group. So he's able to build his expertise with the individuals in that group. But when we turn around and we promote that across the social media channels, what we're tacitly saying is, this client of mine is so trusted that he's been invited to come speak to this group. He has such expertise that he's been invited to come speak to this group. And then we do a quarterly newsletter where we will actually talk about all the speaking engagements he's done when we send that out to his power partners. So again, what we're doing is we're saying, hey, this geriatric care manager is so trusted that he's able to go out and do these speaking engagements. You should feel confident making referrals to him because he truly is an expert in this area. Last year, I guess 2019, feels like it was, or no, 2020, he was invited to come testify in front of the legislature on some senior care issues. So obviously, we did a press release. We actually issued a press release to the local media talking about him going to the Capitol and testifying, and then what that meant for local seniors. And we did end up getting a media hit out of that. He actually got interviewed on TV. So that was another way that we used a speaking engagement, in this case, testifying in front of a legislature, to generate some additional PR, right? That idea of PR that builds on itself. Sponsorships and special events. I've seen the chat box flashing, Kelly. Are there questions before we keep going?
Well, there's one that you kind of answered, but I'll ask. So once you write a press release, how do you get it to the places? Do you have to pay for them to cover the story? And they said, sorry, they're new to this.
Ooh, no, that is a wonderful question. I'm so glad that you asked that, because there are so many places that say you have to pay for PR, and that is absolutely false. I'll tell you, kind of one of the most shocking ones I had here recently was we sent out a press release, and the newspaper came back and said, well, we only run these if you pay for them. And I wanted to respond, like, where's the journalistic integrity in that? That's paid promotion. At the point in time where you're paying for your press releases to get placement, that's paid promotion. I'm actually going to talk about this at the end when I talk about PR and SEO. But kind of in the broader context of, should you be paying for press release placement? The answer is no. Part of what makes that third-party, trusted, and credible is the fact that they're not being compensated for that. 5 or 6 years ago, we really saw the lines blur with content marketing, where you were seeing companies, especially the Fortune 500s, write these really nice articles that looked and sounded like news, and then putting them in newspapers and magazines. Since then, a bunch of professional organizations have said, that this clearly needs to be labeled as advertising. But kind of at the height of this, Starbucks actually hired a New York Times reporter to create this, like, brand journalism is the actual name of it. So there's a difference between brand journalism, which is a marketing channel, and then public relations, again, where it's unpaid and placement isn't guaranteed. If someone comes to you, and I do see this quite a bit with my small business clients, someone comes to them and says, hey, we can get your PR, pay for it, pass. Typically, if you're paying to get in front of their audience isn't that good of quality anyway. So hopefully that answers your question. If not, continue on in the chat. And we'll come back to that again when we get to PR and SEO a little bit too. So let's talk about sponsorships and special events. I'm going to clump these two together because, again, the way you approach them is pretty much the same. Now, sponsorship can be a range of things, everything from sponsoring a little league team to sponsoring a neighborhood cleanup to sponsoring a day of action or an awareness day. So one of the nonprofit organizations that I used to belong to had a section of highway just outside of Omaha that they did litter control on. So we'd go pick up trash, I think twice a year was what Department of Roads had asked us to do. So we talk about it on social media, and we framed it up as just another way that we were giving back to the community. Days of action, when I worked in the home care space, a lot of times we had Alzheimer's, the Walk to End Alzheimer's, and then Moving Day for Parkinson's awareness. Those were events that our franchisees participated in, and we used that as an opportunity not only to promote on Facebook, but we also went out to their referral sources and talked about their participation in the community, as well as trying to get media availability, especially in some of the smaller media markets, because we knew the press was going to be at that event covering it, since it was a big event put on by 2 major national foundations. So we tried to piggyback and get our franchisees TV spots. Hey, reporter, since you're going to be out there, why don't you interview our franchisee who's providing senior care services? So those can also be viewed as special events if you're not necessarily sponsoring one of those type of things. One of the special events I think that works really well for a lot of my small business clients, and again, most of my clients are in that B2B space, not B2C, so your mileage may vary here, but we do a lot of lunch and learns. So this is where, particularly my clients who are in the geriatric care management or patient advocacy space, will reach out to a doctor's office, a health network, or a hospital, and we've got a handful of lunch and learn presentations queued up for them, and say, hey, I've got a presentation about how patient advocates improve health outcomes. I'd really like to come in and give this to the social workers in the hospital. If I brought in lunch, could we do a lunch and learn? And a lot of times that gets really well received. And again, we can build this 2 ways. One, we get to build expertise in front of that group of people that are participating in the lunch and learn, but then we can also turn around and we can talk about the lunch and learn that we hosted on our social media, in our email newsletters, and so on, as a way to build our credibility with other folks, and then also show that we're giving back to the community. I think it's important to note that customers look favorably on businesses that give back to their community. Inc. magazine, which is a fantastic magazine for small business owners, they did a survey here, I think it was 2019, at the end of 2019, where they found 82% of consumers said that corporate social responsibility falls into their decision-making process. So if you are one of those small businesses that is out there doing a lot of good things, but you're not talking about it or framing it up on social media or putting it in your email, you're missing an opportunity to have customers look favorably on you. So then finally, we're going to wrap it up here of different PR tactics on the marketing research and content creation, because again, I think these two really go hand in hand. So for those of you who have got a robust content marketing program, When we create that cornerstone content for SEO purposes, often you're identifying industry trends. You might be engaging in some original research or highlighting research that has been done about your industry, about consumer behavior, about consumer preferences. All of this that's in that cornerstone content can be a PR-worthy activity if framed properly. So I'll give another example from some work I did with a client. For this client, they're a patient advocate. And what we did was we wrote a really long ebook that was going to be used as a lead generation. So if you're in the B2B space, you're probably familiar. You go to a website to download an ebook or a white paper, and in exchange for that download, you have to put in your contact information. So you then go into a sales funnel, right? We're probably all familiar with that. So that was the intent of the ebook, was to be lead gen. So once the ebook was done, and we highlighted in that ebook medical and financial benefits of life care management, once that ebook was done, we reached out to local associations and trade publications for elder law attorneys, estate planners, financial advisors, and medical professionals. We reached out to a handful of selected social media influencers that we thought could reshare highlights from this book. And then we pitched the ebook to the local media. In this case, we didn't issue a press release. We actually got on the phone and called up the producer and the reporters who covered that senior care beat and asked them if they'd be interested in reading the ebook. And if they were, if they'd be interested in inviting my client onto their television show. So the outreach was actually really successful because of that ebook, and because we had those third parties out there talking about how great this book was and how insightful it was. That built up my client's expertise, or their perception of their expertise and their reputation. We generated more leads than we would have if we hadn't done any PR surrounding the book. The client also was invited to appear on one of the TV station's morning programs and talk about her industry and how life care managers help seniors and families educate or navigate the aging process. So you've been listening here, you know what we did next then was we took that TV appearance, went back out to our social media and talked about how the client is an expert, how my client is, perceived to be trustworthy enough to go on TV and talk about these aging issues, right? So we used that PR that built on itself and further elevated their reputation in the community as a life care manager. So then finally on the list was crisis communications. And it's a critical PR tool. We could spend the next hour talking about crisis communications and how to do it. What I want to draw your attention to is, up until this point, what we've been talking about in terms of PR is what I call blue skies PR, right? Everything's good, everything's going well. The point of the PR is to build reputation, build relationships, and elevate the perception of our business, our brand, our products and services in the community. That's blue sky PR. It's fun, we're proactive. There's stormy times PR too, right? This is where your business is maybe the target of a negative story, or your industry is facing headwinds for some reason. So take, for example, right now, the pandemic in the travel industry. The travel industry's had to make a concerted PR effort to educate the public about the safety precautions they're taking to keep their customers safe, to encourage people to travel again. A little bit closer to home, back when I was working a corporate job in home care, one of the franchisees, a competitor, had a caregiver who was caught stealing from a bunch of clients. So my franchisee, anticipating a negative media reaction, reached out to me and said, oh my gosh, we've got to get out ahead of this. What do we do? Right? This had nothing to do with their specific business, but the negative story was going to impact the entire industry in that media market. So what we did was we developed a communication strategy, right? Thinking back to the definition of PR, right? It's strategic communication. So we came up with the way that we could frame our pitch to the local media. So we knew the local media was going to cover this story. Our franchisee reached out to a few of the reporters that they had a relationship with, talked about the controls that they had in place to make sure they were hiring good, honest people. And they talked about ways that people who are receiving in-home care can remain vigilant and protect themselves from a bad actor. When the story broke in the media, we had a campaign, an email campaign ready to go out to clients. and referral sources, reminding them of the precautions that were in place. You know, and again, the PR is sometimes hard to measure, so it's hard to say how much good this did, if it prevented clients from leaving or if it helped boost the confidence of referral sources, but it helped the franchisee not feel like a bystander and feel more active and in control of their business. So when you're thinking about crisis communication, think of it not only what should you do if something negative happened to your business, but also what's going on in the industry. Like I said, we could spend a few hours talking about this. SCORE has a really fantastic crisis communication planning checklist on their website. If you just Google that, it'll take you and you can download that checklist. It's obviously it's SCORE, so it's free. So I'd recommend checking that out. That's where I send a lot of my clients if they've got crisis communication questions. So finally, in the last 5 minutes we have remaining, I'm going to be real quick and talk about public relations and SEO. The first thing I said is, 10 years ago, it used to be companies went out and they said, hey, buy some PR, press releases, we'll write them for you, we'll put them on our website, and that will create SEO juice for your website, right? Because links are the currency of the internet, right? The more links you have going back to your website, the better you rank in search. Well, Google wised up to this game about a decade ago. And now if you use one of those PR services where they put a press release up that's SEO'd and has some links back to your website, you don't get any SEO juice out of that. However, if your PR results in media coverage, that can be golden, right? Because when Google looks at different websites, it gives them a reputation ranking. So your local news station is going to have really good reputation in Google's eyes. So if you can get some links from those news organizations back to your website, that's a really strong tool for your SEO. So organic SEO, the stuff, or organic PR, the stuff that you don't pay for, can be a really valuable SEO tool. And I think next week is the SEO presentation. So if you want more information on SEO, make sure you're registered for next week's topic. That does it for me. I've got 4 minutes left for questions, so we didn't go over like I was worried about, kept the stories to a minimum. What questions do you folks have?
So far, there are no more questions.
So everybody checked out for lunch.
So it looks like, yeah.
Thoughts, comments? In
So
general.
it says, thanks for the presentation, very useful.
Excellent.
So once you send me the PDF of your slides, I'll get them sent out to everyone.
I've got a call here at 1 o'clock. So Kelly, I will get those over to you as soon as that next call is done.
Excellent. All right. Well, we hope to see you all next week and have a great rest of this week.
Thank you.
Bye,
Have a good day,
everyone.